Hello, and in this presentation we will be talking about the region of Russia and its neighboring countries, which includes parts of Eastern Europe and Southern Asia. Russia is the largest geographically, the largest physical country in the world, but much of Russia is highly remote areas of a sub-region known as Siberia. To understand Russia as a region, one has to go back to both the colonial days of Russian expansion, that would be the late 19th century, as well as the industrialization and political expansion during the 20th century, specifically the rise of communism and the transformation of Russia into a larger sovereign state known as the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union essentially came about as the Russian government, primarily the monarchy and the provisional government following the monarchy, politically fell during the middle of World War I, roughly around 1916, 1917. And as a result, the Bolshevik Revolution began in October of that year and continued to consolidate Russian interests, the original sort of colonial interests, and eventually expanded those interests into neighboring countries. Today, Russia, is really thought of as sort of a series of republics with surrounding countries and regions that, while independent, are still economically and in many ways politically tied to the central interests that exist in Russia today. So this is a map of the former Soviet, quote-unquote, Soviet Empire. You see here that there was sort of this vast Russian territory, which represents the former monarchy or the former kingdom of Russia, which had expanded throughout the 19th. Well, I should actually go back a little bit and say that it started expanding during the 16th and 17th century, sort of the famous Alexander the Great. I'm sorry, not Alexander the Great. Peter the Great. Peter the Great, who created a vast Russian empire to the east of the west of the Ural Mountains, which is this region in through here, and then his daughter took over his work and began expanding into mostly Eastern Europe, places like Poland, the Ukraine, and so forth. In subsequent years, the monarchy would continue to expand westward, although they control vast territories up in places like Siberia and along the west coast. There was really little control of these vast regions beyond the coastlines. There wasn't any kind of infrastructure in place until the latter part of the 19th century, and really no significant infrastructure into the central regions of Russia until the communist era. The communists, once they consolidated power in the former Russian czars, czar is sort of Russian for king, territories, they began to move into south and western regions. places like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, consolidating power in what's called the Caucasus regions, which is down here in Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, as well as Ukraine, Moldova, and the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. The natural environment of Russia is, of course, quite diverse because it is such a large country. However, since so much of it is in a northern latitude, you don't find tropical regions. What you do find is vast temperate regions where you have huge mountainous areas alongside forests, marshlands, low riverbeds, high plains, and so forth, which are all kind of listed here on this particular slide. This gives you a little bit more of a picture of the kinds of regions that you do find in Russia. The thing to keep in mind most about Russia is that because of the vast areas of land in Siberia, places like here, that are so far away from coastlines, and yet the land is so far north that this particular region experiences some of the harshest weather in terms of cold weather in the world. It's one of the things to keep in mind when looking at different regions and how weather patterns impact climate. Typically, coastlines or areas with vast coastlines, even in northern parts of the world, tend to be warmer. And in the case of Russia, that's just simply not so. The vast majority of Russian coastline is the Arctic Ocean, which is frozen at least half the time of the year. The areas of Siberia, as well as in western Russia, have experienced a variety of environmental problems, particularly as a result of management by the Soviet forces. As I said, the Bolsheviks took over. Sort of the famous leader of the Bolsheviks was Vladimir Lenin, who passed away in the 1920s and was, through a series of coups, was replaced by Joseph Stalin, who arguably was as tyrannical as Adolf Hitler in terms of the way that he ruled his country, and certainly in terms of the number of people that lost their lives or that suffered under his leadership. During those periods of Soviet control, both through Lenin, Stalin, Khrushchev, and others, Brezhnev, and later on other sort of less known leaders, there is tremendous problems that occurred environmentally. There was a big push among the Soviets to industrialize Russia the way that Western Europe had been industrialized during the 19th century. And so in order to achieve that, there was a tremendous effort to build large-scale power plants, to build them quickly and not efficiently, and to tap into vast resources, particularly oil, coal resources throughout the interior regions. In addition, Soviet Union became nuclearized, became a nuclear power in the 1950s, following the United States, who was sort of is considered to be the first nuclear power. The Soviets began to not just look at nuclear weapons, but were very interested in how nuclear power could become the primary fuel for their vast and very rapid efforts to industrialize. This gives you a little bit of a understanding about the network of mining of natural resources throughout the region. When we look at regions of the world and we talk about, where most of the economy in that particular region thrives, or how does economy in a particular region thrives, we oftentimes talk about them in terms of stages. When we think about regions that are like in, for example, Africa, most of the region thrives on primary level development, meaning that most people live off of subsistence farming or are herdsmen, in other words, ranching or nomadic nomadic cattle tribes. You find that in Africa. You also find people making their living off of mining or the extraction of natural resources. There are other areas of the world that also thrive off the extraction of natural resources, but have done that in a very industrialized or to an industrialized capacity, and Russia is that example. And you can see this in terms of the network of resources where the Russians have tried to capitalize on their available materials. There's a lot of interest in the development of natural resource throughout Russia, not just in terms of the oil and gas industry as pictured here, but also the vast reserves of lumber and other materials in the interior region that have not been tapped into because of the fact that infrastructure was not fully developed until the middle to latter parts of the 20th century. What we see today with Russia in the extraction of natural resources is that Russia, while became highly industrialized during the Soviet era, much of that industrialization crumbled over time. Again, as I mentioned, building of power plants quite quickly, as well as factories, the building of cheap goods, cars, electronics that are not sort of up to the same standards as we find in Western Europe or in the Western parts of the world, were not competitive, and so therefore, when the Soviet Union did finally collapse and Russia resorted back to being, an independent country with neighboring countries still tied to it, but each country being independent, much of that industrial base was lost, and so most of the Russian economy today is reliant on, the extraction of these natural resources, particularly the oil and gas industry. Russia is really second only to Saudi Arabia in terms of its global production of oil and gas resources. Even though their reserves may not be as strong as that found in the Middle East, they're very aggressive about tapping into these resources and making them available to more wealthier nations, particularly in Western Europe. Here is a list of some of the other kinds of this is a map of the places where industrialization has created huge environmental problems. The Soviets chopped down tremendous amounts of woodlands in order to build power plants. In addition, they were not particularly good about cleaning up their environment, as well as dealing with things like atomic waste. And this kind of pollution from the Soviet era is still a problem for Russia today. Having such a vast country that is relatively unpopulated for its size, creates sort of good and bad opportunities. The good being that there are wonderful opportunities to cultivate natural resources for economic purposes globally. The bad is that there are lots of pockets or places, and that's what these icons represent, where pollution can go unchecked without it affecting large portions of the population. And of course, nothing gets cleaned up. It just simply sits there and gets worse, and that over time can be problematic. So the most famous environmental hazard associated with the Soviets would be the reactor plant Chernobyl, which was built in the Ukraine. Chernobyl in the late 1980s had what's called a complete meltdown. Meltdowns had not occurred in the world prior to that. There have been situations where reactors had gone offline, or there have been sort of critical overheating. In the United States, the most dangerous example was 3 Mile Island, a power plant along the East Coast that almost experienced a complete meltdown, which a meltdown basically means that the interior core of the reactor breaks down and then releases tremendous amounts of radioactive material. It's not happened in the United States. It happened in Chernobyl. The only other time this has happened in the world is with the Fukushima power plant in Japan a few years back, which was caused by an earthquake and a gigantic tsunami that completely wiped out that particular installation. So, as I said, the Russian Empire was built initially by Peter the Great, and his his descendants were the ones who sort of completed his overall vision for Russia. This idea of a kind of pan-Russian empire. When we think about empire development or empire building, looking at, for example, Western Europe and the expansion of Spain and Portugal initially into the Western Hemisphere, and then later on the British and the French into North America, Africa, Southeast Asia, along with the Dutch. This is, in Western Europe terms, the imperialization is this idea of going abroad and colonizing or sort of taking over large sections of the world for economic purposes from afar. In the case of Russia, their empire building, their colonization occurred directly to the east of what is traditionally Russian-held, ethnic Russian-held lands. And so what they call Russification is sort of this process of Russia looking to the east to try to create vast wealth and colonies similar to their counterparts in Western Europe, but having the available land next door to cultivate, whereas the British, the French, the Dutch having to go abroad in order to do that. Same thing with the initially with the Spanish and the Portuguese back during the 15th and 16th century. The Soviet Union simply is an basically a sort of takeover of the government by a small faction of individuals who claim to sort of claim the Russian Empire for the people. Unfortunately, when we talk about communism, we talk about the rise of the Soviets, the rise of the Bolsheviks, is while they were interested in expanding this kind of Marxist ideology of communism, ultimately what they achieved was simply a kind of totalitarian government, a highly authoritarian government with limited freedoms provided to the average individual, with the idea that the overall production of the population was to move towards enriching the community or the nation as a whole. Unfortunately, the only individuals to benefit from this growth was a small few who sort of sat at the top of that, Soviet empire, which is not unlike what we saw with the rise of the Russian Empire. The difference is the Russian Empire was dominated by a noble class, a monarchy, a feudal system, whereas the Soviet system was sort of party-led, but again, similar kinds of hierarchies or social structures. this gives you a little bit of understanding about the cultural diversity of the Russian region. Um, Much of this region has been what the term I use, Russified, meaning that ethnic Russians, starting during starting during the Tsar or the monarchy, there was this effort to try to entice or encourage, or in some cases force, ethnic Russians to move westward or into southern areas of Russian-held territory. Um, Traditional Russian lands is in this area here, areas between Moscow and St. Petersburg, which is up in this area here. But as you can see, the Soviets, well, the Tsar, and then of course his successors, the Soviets, were very successful at moving Russians into the interior, and trying to capture much of this land for Russian interests, Russian ethnic interests, even though, as you can see, vast areas of this is also still ethnically controlled by other groups. To understand this kind of movement, think of the here in the United States, we have there's a term used called manifest destiny, which is a term that was coined during the 19th century. During the 1800s, you have vast immigrant populations moving into the United States, coming here for certainly for factory jobs and other economic opportunities. But the big draw to the United States was, during the 19th century, was free farming, opportunity to achieve or attain free land as long as you're willing to work it and cultivate it or improve that land over time. And the idea was that in the case of the United States, the idea was that the United States would be completely occupied by American citizens from the Atlantic to the Pacific coast within a century, and that was certainly achieved. Between the 1780s, the Revolutionary War, and the 1880s, or even really by the 1890s, most of the territory between the two coasts was completely occupied by primarily white settlers. Native Americans were confined to reservations, or were somehow integrated into this kind of agrarian economy that was completely dominant across the United States. This is what manifest destiny is. In fact, the Russians have tried their own version of manifest destiny to varying degrees of success throughout the region. And again, this map kind of reflects some of that. The Chinese have also sort of engaged in their own version of manifest destiny, trying to move ethnic Chinese from predominant Han regions along the eastern half of the country, particularly the coastline near Beijing and Shanghai, inland and even further out west into territories bordering Mongolia and Afghanistan and so forth. So historically, this territory has been dominated by different groups. The Rus, the ethnic Russians, sort of captured their own territory from the Mongols, who were successful in the latter part of the Middle Ages to create a vast territory, one of the largest land-held territories in the world. Although much of the land that the Mongols controlled was uninhabited. But over time, the Mongols were successful in taking much of Western Europe, all of Southern Asia, and even capturing and conquering China and making it its own and transforming China into a very different kind of empire. The Russians finally in the latter part of the Middle Ages were able to rise as the principal ethnic population, and with the help of Western principalities, Christian principalities, Russia rose as the dominant, certainly after the fall of Constantinople to Muslim invaders. Russia emerged as the principal Eastern Orthodox Christian empire or kingdom in Eastern Europe. And that's what you're seeing in this map here. And from there, as I said, there's tremendous growth of the empire over several centuries. Peter the Great being the most well-known, he sort of had this vision of building Western ports and unifying Russia, or actually really kind of transforming Russia into a kind of Western superpower. Before that, Russia was really thought of as either being kind of an Eastern country or even more of an Asian, nation. But the Russians really had this idea that they were more European than they were Asian. Following Peter the Great is Catherine the Great, who, as I said, was set the stage for continual expansion. And then each generation past Peter and Catherine was able to attain or acquire more land. This continued until the late 19th century, when Russia was engaged in a war with Japan. Japan, we'll talk about in a different presentation, was engaged in its own imperial aims, took on Russia, and Russia unsuccessfully tried to defend some of its Eastern territories, its Asian territories, in what would be northern China today, and the Japanese were able to occupy that territory between basically World War I and the end of World War II. The changes in this region started to occur quite dramatically in the 1980s. Leading up to World War II, Russia, the Soviet Union, was controlled by Joseph Stalin. Stalin's power continued to surge even after World War II, because Stalin was considered, or the Soviet Union was considered, an ally of the United States, Great Britain, and France temporarily in the overthrow of Adolf Hitler. Following the ousting of Hitler and the Nazis' power over Germany, essentially the Soviets rose as a player, as a global player. They had occupied vast countries and territories throughout Eastern Europe that had been controlled by the Nazis. Following World War II, they did not leave this territory. They simply took countries that had been occupied by the occupied by the Nazis, claimed that they were now liberated, they were now communist, and established communist-friendly governments throughout Eastern Europe. So countries like Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Moldova, all these different countries throughout Eastern Europe became quote-unquote allies, or as many Western historians have sort of put it, puppet governments controlled by the Soviet government in Moscow. And essentially established this kind of Cold War relationship between the East and the West. The East being, the Soviet-held territories, and the West being all of Western Europe, which included half of Germany, because of course the Soviets occupied the areas of Germany around Berlin. So the western half was Western Europe, United States, Canada, or allies against this kind of Eastern Bloc. In the 1980s, it was becoming clear that the Soviets were really struggling economically. Again, that infrastructure that I mentioned, power plants, factories, production of durable goods was not to the same standards as Western companies or Western manufacturers. And so by the late 1980s, it was clear that the Soviet Union was going to collapse, and what would come after it was of big concern and big question. Terms like perestroika and glasnost were opportunities, or were situations where the Soviets tried to create a kind of transitional government or transitional set of freedoms between the more sort of authoritarian Soviet system and a kind of capitalist system, free market system. These sort of reform efforts didn't really last very long, because certainly as the Soviet Union collapsed and these different countries sort of claimed their own independence, there were sort of new opportunities to arise, and essentially each country kind of went in its own different direction. You can sort of see some examples of human rights issues. The Great Terror sort of references Stalin's sort of brutality between the 1920s and the 1950s. Large numbers of individuals were rounded up and sent to labor camps or gulags in Siberia or in northern parts of Russia. Scientists like Sakharov's were detained and forced to live in Soviet controlled closed cities, which is how the Soviets sort of developed their technology, was to simply detain well-known individuals, scientists, inventors, thinkers, and force them to work on projects that only the Soviets felt would advance their overall global and political interests. Following the fall of the Soviet Union, you see several instances of both the Russians trying to retain power over particular regions that desired their own independence. In some cases, like the Baltic states, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, they were able to get away from the Soviet or from the Russian control without much violence. But in places like the Ukraine, more recently we've seen in the Ukraine, ethnic Russians trying to hold on to economic and political control of that, ultimately what is an independent country and has been for over 20 years. In other places, territories within Russia, in effect states or provinces within Russia, have also rebelled. Chechnya is sort of one of the big, sort of the most high-profile example. A province in the southern part of the Caucasus region, which has a very strong Muslim population, wishing to attain its independence from Moscow and not being successful in fighting a civil war as a result of that. One thing to keep in mind about human rights issues within the Soviet Union, and certainly this continues over into Russia, is that women have been provided a tremendous amount of economic, political, social benefits that have not been as forthcoming in the West. Women were given the right to vote, reproduction rights, education, many opportunities in management, equal pay, things like this, education, have all been kind of a hallmark of the of the Soviet system. That said, women have also been the brunt of physical violence as a result of huge alcoholism issues throughout Russia, as well as being accosted sexually. Prostitution and sex trafficking are big problems in Eastern Europe, particularly because the economies there have struggled so. Women as well as men, have looked for ways to try to find economic opportunities and have ended up finding themselves enslaved in what is a robust sex trafficking operation. As I've kind of highlighted in the maps, the greatest population in Russia is west of the Ural Mountains, what is traditionally the ethnic Russian areas. East of the Ural Mountains, vast open areas. Basically think of a giant version of Alaska. There are some railroad systems that run along here. The sort of one of the famous Trans-Siberian Railroad goes from Moscow to the east coast of Russia. The slide mentions Lake Baikal. Lake Baikal is one of the deepest lakes in the world. Interestingly, when they first built the Trans-Siberian Railroad, they tried to build the tracks across the water, directly across the water, and actually it gets so cold in Siberia that in the wintertime you can actually run the trains on the ice. But of course, as the ice melts, you do run the risk of trains falling into the bottom of the lake, which has happened. The thing to keep in mind about Russia, when I mentioned to you about Russification and the movement of ethnic Russians into eastern areas, is that the Soviets were also very particular about trying to move other ethnic groups out of their traditional territories and to other places. In other words, to try to sort of not only displace Russians, but also displace other ethnic groups so that they themselves don't have a particular geographic attachment. That was sort of the issue with Chechnya, is that Chechens were not successful in moving Chechens out of their sort of historic homeland, and so therefore, when the fall of the Soviet Union occurred, Russia was sort of faced with a ethnic population that wanted its own geographic independence. Whereas other areas, not a lot of some of the sort of ethnic populations aren't as attached to their indigenous homeland because of what the Soviets had done in terms of moving people around the country. You can see from this map pockets of population, again most to the east along the borders. This is true even of the neighboring states. Most of the neighboring highly populated parts of the neighboring states down here in Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, highly populated. These particular regions, what they call the stands, are predominantly Muslim, but because of their vast oil and gas reserves, which are owned or controlled by Russian held companies, their economic ties are very much still towards Russia. Big population pockets down here in the Ukraine and Belarus. Belarus being Moscow's closest ally. Minsk is, or the Belarus, or what's also called White Russia, very much has a very similar ethnic identity to the ethnic Russians. This gives you an idea about kind of Russification, the idea of moving Russians around the country so that you end up with either a majority or a near majority population in big sections of of the country. And even today, this has become kind of an issue. In the case of the Ukraine, for example, the eastern half of the Ukraine is very much ethnically Russian. And in some situations, Russians, particularly in places like Georgia and in places like the Crimea, the Russian government and the Russian military have felt the need to go in and quote unquote protect ethnic Russians from local conflicts. However, much of these local conflicts are the result of to retain connections with Moscow, whereas many of these ethnic populations on the outskirts of Russia, like the Ukrainians, the Moldovians, the Georgians, the Armenians, would rather cultivate relationships outside of Russia, particularly with Western Europe and the European Union and NATO and so forth. Again, this gives you an idea about significant populations of Russians. This area down here, for example, this is the Crimean, was during the Soviet era part of the Ukraine. There's a major Russian base. In fact, the Black Sea fleet of the Russian Navy is based here. Recently, in other words, in the last 18 months, Russia, fearing civil war in the Ukraine, reclaimed this land. In other words, actually re-annexed this land back to Russia. And so this has created a huge international conflict because, of course, the Ukrainians think that the Russians have basically invaded their land, taken over land. The Russians think that they've simply just reclaimed land that they already owned. So not a lot of... it'll be interesting to see how that develops over time. When we look at Russia, most of it is urbanized. Most people live in urban areas because of the lack of infrastructure. Really, the most economic opportunities that exist are going to be in the cities. Slavic countries, Russians are technically Slavic. They speak, Russian as a language, shares the same kind of language traditions as most every other Eastern European language. But Russia really considers itself to be, they sort of consider themselves to be dominant or above other Slavic interests. What you find in terms of economic situations, as I said, there's a lot of economic hardship. The fall of the Soviet Union, while the Soviet Union was a very repressive environment, so the goal of the Soviets was to provide everybody with a job. And so it was a self-generating economy for the most part. Since the fall, you find big pockets of individuals who have no job. Homelessness, of course, is on the rise. Russia believes that the only way that the economic hardships can be overcome is simply by continuing to cultivate the foreign investment or the trading relationships with neighboring countries that they've had for centuries. The problem is they're not necessarily willing to pay the same rate or provide the same kinds of, when it comes to developing factories, provide the same kinds of opportunities as Western investors. And so there's a real kind of issue about Western investment moving further into Eastern countries and that becoming sort of a threatening, sort of creating, threatening the stability of Russia as well as the relationship between Russia's neighbors. So when we look at Russia as an overall country, there is no single kind of, here in the United States, for example, or most democracies, we see sort of a uniform distribution of land and the way that land is managed. In the United States, we have states. Each state has its own rights and has its own sort of set of representation. In places like England or in France, the same thing is true. Provinces or other kind of territories all kind of have equal rights. In the case of Russia, some territories have more rights than others. Some are provided more autonomy than others, depending on whether or not local control is sympathetic to the interests of Moscow, or whether or not the population is highly diversified or not, whether there's a lot of economic interest. In other words, is there situations where where the central government in Moscow can capitalize on the cultivation of oil and gas resources without having to sort of go through local control or local regulation. And there's a whole kind of discussion about this in the books about this. This kind of gives you a little bit of a map about the administrative and autonomous regions. The administrative regions, these are basically these oblasts. These are sort of areas that the Okrug that Moscow sort of administers. So think of these as like territories, like federal territories. It's pretty complicated. It's in some cases really hard to try to understand the relationship between Moscow and these different places. If you have any questions about the chapters on Russia or its neighbors, certainly let me know. There's a lot of complexity to this, but the most important thing to understand about this region is we define it as a region mostly because of what happened following World War II. The Cold War, the rise of the Soviets, the domination of the Soviets in this particular part of the world as a competing superpower to the United States really is how we define this particular region in the boundaries of this particular region. And while Soviet Union has fallen, Russia is still a very dominant force militarily and politically and increasingly economically in something that is part of will be an ongoing discussion in other discussions about other regions that we're talking about. Thank you.